Hello everyone, today we talk about 15th century devotional practice through Italian examples, and you say probably, oh no, it's about ecclesiastical history again. Yes, it is, but I can tell you that I'm preparing some Anglo-Saxon warrior videos incoming, and today's topic is, say, movements, religious orders and clergy and believers, naturally, in a very peculiar moment in the history of the church, one of crisis, as we will see in a while, that, however, brought to new forms, say, of restoration from one side, of control, right, of framing of devotional experiences from one side, but also to innovation from the other. You know that fundamentally in the last medieval century, this ferment of that would eventually lead to the reform, also to the rise, obviously the intertwinement with ecclesiological, theological matters of strong political aspects, such as the rise of, say, even religious movements on the base of national identities. Think about the Hussites. In a world that is difficult for us to understand along these patterns, in a stateless world where there's still certain belief that sometimes we don't understand the dynamics or mechanics of, because just we don't practice anymore. But here we would have to give a bit of a further background to it, and we'll do it on another occasion in other videos. But let's say that speaking of the time, like the 15th century, see, at the beginning of the previous one, in 14th century, there is this big event that is the Jubilee, right? That becomes the symbol, even though it was actually required from the lower, was solicited at least from the popular classes, of the plenitude of grace of the church, right? That's the moment of can't say properly the greatest strength in absolute terms of the church, but definitely of the system that had supported it, of France, of the church, etc., was saying clash between the Caesaro-papistic tendencies of the King of France and the clash with Boniface VIII, the end of the Great Crusading period, at least in the Near East. And therefore, a moment that also, from the socio-economical point of view, had already showed the first signs of the crisis, etc. But it was still a rich word, was like still part of that great medieval, say, high medieval civilization that eventually disappeared with the crisis of the 14th century and contracted into something else that contributed to discipline once again. This monstrous system that had expanded by sheer size. I mean, and of differences, let's say, and of heterogeneities, from which, however, the church had managed to come out as the leading spiritual guide with important political intersection. And the empire had already basically failed in terms of actual power. Say, France had taken a bit its place as the main, with this Axis France papacy, but also would suffer further through the 14th century crisis, of which the church would suffer as well. Right. So, what started to happen, let's say, at sociological, maybe even, I don't want to sound too psychologistic, but let's say, was through the crisis of the church, the perception of, let's say, the incapacity of salvation from the same, right? There is this, at the end of the 14th century, a very different religious, generally, religious climate, atmosphere, because the church is in deep crisis. It doesn't manage to come out of the unsustainable situation in which it finds itself after the opening of the Great Schism of the West, 1378, and therefore the split of the Catholic world in two literal obediences, as were called. That is, the Roman one, which included the Empire, England, Ireland, Flanders, northern Italy, Florence, and the Avignonese one formed by France, Scotland, Castile, Portugal, Savoy, Aragon, Navarre, and the Kingdom of Naples. So this period is marked, therefore, by a great sense of, anxiety that is portrayed at many levels. We have made, I think, a month ago a video on how this reflected specifically on devotional art, right, from a properly artistic point of view. But it was a big deal because we often forget, for example, at the beginning of the early modern age, that the greatest trauma ever for Western civilization, in absolute terms, had nothing to do with the Ottoman invasion, nothing to do with the discovery of the Americas. It was literally the reform. It was the idea that Christianity, that was the main identity shared by what eventually we call the Europeans, let's say, in a more modern sense, but it was the fact that the word Christian was a single Christian unity, right? And the fact that this was split, right, through like the 16th century, we perceive it as the Renaissance, but from the perspective of those who inhabited that, it was one of the most radically traumatizing moments in history, not just because, of course, of all the wars, etc., but because of the break of this ecclesiastical unity. And with the Great Schism between the 14th and 15th century, we have bit the same thing. It was a very political thing. As you know, there were multiple popes, basically. Eventually, the Catholic Church was reunited, and they called them kind of anti-popes. But at the time, like, where would, which one would have you chosen, let's say? As we have just listed with these, observed with the list of these countries, it was a highly political thing. I noticed we still have to make a video on the Great Schism. We've never done it. It's kind of weird. But anyhow, so what, consider this was all worsened by the recurrent threat of the plague, wars, naturally. And so, however, we find new devotional experiences, right? And one that we talk about today is a popular devotio developed in central northern Italy in 1399, right? And the chroniclers that at this point really write much and articulately trace the origins of the devotio in also in variable places according on the different versions. Some say a distant one, such as Provence, the Dauphiné, Spain, even Scotland, according to some authors. Because in this place, whichever it was, would have happened an apparition of the Virgin to a peasant who was told by her, was prescribed by her of a penitence rite that could essentially give strength to her intercession towards a very angered Christ, right? Christ would have been angered because of the sins of humanity, and therefore it would have been decided to destroy it completely, right? And in the narrative, there is a great disparity between the legend that sounds like, obviously, like a justification of the facts, let's say, ex post, and the unfolding of the rite itself, which can be briefly summed up like this: that is, processions of men, women, and children dressed in white. So they were called the whites properly for this, that began to swarm from Liguria into the Po Valley and then eventually down to Rome, visiting daily the churches, praying, singing sacred hymns, fasting, and operating pieces, right, between individuals and groups, right? And the devotio, the devotion that lasted 9 days, spread also in the centers of the countryside that in Italy were very connected with the cities, more than any other country in Europe. And it had generally, except for some say, exception, the support of the ecclesiastical and civilian authorities that controlled its developments. There is some exception to this, just like in Venice, where the albi, so in Latin, the whites, the albi devotees were dispersed with force and the promoters severely punished. But in spite of, let's say, the accent on penitence that was present in the instruction of the Virgin, it doesn't seem thus that this was actually properly the cream of the white devotion, at least in the most mature phase, because its development had as distinctive characters, yes, an intense Marian devotion, but also the accentuation of a sacramental practice that normally was the confession or the Eucharistic communion that preceded the entrance in the white ranks, the preaching of expert theologians, the pursuing of peace against the spread social violence. And okay, we could comment looking a bit at the political context there, but let's say in general that this wasn't anything properly new in itself as a general complaint against violence, etc. It was all rhetoric, but it was indeed a violent world, but still under the control of important authorities here, mostly city-states, the signories, etc. But anyhow, this is intertwined naturally with the broader crisis of the lower classes that during the 14th century had suffered the most from, the contraction of the economy and all these things. So this goes in parallel with other, many other devotional experiences that in the Middle Ages at large, I would say. But the penitential aspect was present in a rather light way, let's say, but it was well regulated, and only in certain cases things like flagellation, for example, were carried out, and the latter was was controlled by the confraternities with some good internal discipline that had ritualized flagellation over time, so problems weren't really connected there. And differently from what we would be brought to believe, considering the pretty harsh problems of that time, the movement of the whites channeled thus in a controlled way the tensions of the moment and those that had been part of the broader Christian eschatological sensitivity. And in the first place, however, went always the hope for peace and of pardon, of forgiveness. And this is an important accomplishment of the society and the church of the time at the end of the day, because as you know, even up to 200 years before, such movements could be pretty also dangerous in many ways. There were instances of social revolt, of heterodoxy, and so on. And it's probably not by chance that Pope Boniface IX, in the year 1400, celebrated again the Jubilee, and the Pope had to be solicited to the initiative exactly by the processions of the whites directed to Rome, since these people were wishing the general indulgence that is proper of the Holy Year. And it is interesting that in this anxiety of individual and collective salvation, there was no internal split mirroring the present one of Western Christendom. So that this was a rather unitary experience that didn't quite care, right? It didn't quite take side, and on the contrary showed a unitary faith. And this was complexively beneficial for the Roman papacy, because that's the one that basically received all these pilgrims of the white movement, many of which actually came from the areas of the Avignonese obedience, as we were saying in the beginning. So there was an important display, say, of need of unity that flowed into Rome. And the great events that were involving the church, we have to think that it influenced only partially the behavior of the believers. In a sense, as we were saying at the beginning, it was mostly political, right? So they were mostly interested altogether by the small and large, let's say, existential daily worries rather than the big political games. And as we have seen that the increase in social distance, in certification during the 14th century favored such detachment. Right? So the masses felt, in a sense, ever more detached from an elite that was ever more point of reference as such, right? And the church, Rome by itself, and Rome herself as a city, where now, it was basically the struggle between the pro-Avignonese and the pro-Romans. So embodied naturally the most important symbol. They say Rome had it, obviously, because of the historical, ecclesiological significance, etc., the upper hand in terms of mass appeal over Avignon. So it's thus almost obvious that from this movement stemmed a further development of devotional association, which in fact was further intensified according to those rhythms that we were talking about before. And in spite of the institutional crises, the way traced by the construction of the good faithful, good believer, went ever more precising itself in an orderly lifestyle, right? Where the religious practice was connected and in harmony with the pursuing of an acceptable, idoneous morality in order to strengthen an equilibrated social coexistence. As we were saying before, this is very different from just a few centuries before, and we could say that crisis, as it often happens, also among certain aspects, does increase social discipline because it shows what is, let's say, under pressure more convenient to act unitarily like. Since we're talking about Italy, well, in this country, the weight of the institutions on such vision of Christianity is particularly clear, right? Because the same episode of the Whites teaches it, right? And it's well documented. And we can say that dissent here is gradually rendered marginal and denaturated of its specifically religious contents, which is a very good level of discipline, and differently from what happens actually in the other European regions, where the ecclesiological discussion and the theological debate grafting over, let's say, national political wishes found, let's say, a fertile terrain to manifest also a harsh protest, right? Before we were remembering Bohemia with Jan Hus. Naturally, so that he was eventually put at stake at the Council of Basel in 1415, and the broader religious, social, political, and military movement that stemmed from his message. Naturally, there is a let's say there are certain areas of Europe that are more statalized than others, and this has surely an impact on the capacity of controlling the mass in that regard, and creating further political stability. And it's also maybe here we don't have to talk about the we'll make another video on this and the difficult action of institutional revival carried out by the same Catholicism in the first decades of the 15th century, right? The church here was pushing for a further stabilization on a broader international level. But what is important about it to remember is that Catholicism at this point recognizes itself in the distinctions among the various national identities, which is very important also for the splits that will occur in the 16th. Because in a way, there was not much could be done about that, right? Because the process of statalization naturally went in parallel with one of territorialization. So the church had a greater difficulty than before than actually controlling so extensively as it did, and had to come to terms with this different organization, more local, and we'll maybe talk about it later. But speaking of what we're talking specifically about today, let's say we can remember through certain more punching at least examples on the life of the believers, certain observances of religious orders that we're trying to essentially come back sometimes to the essence of the original rule. We find it in more or less recent orders. There was the Benedictines, the secular and regular canonics, the mendicant orders. Also, very important, there is the management of the cura animarum within some, especially certain dioceses. And we will not talk instead about what the laymen were doing in this sense from an associational point of view, but let's say we have an idea. It was becoming even there ever more, regulated. So if we look at the, let's say, observant religious orders, we see in this period, in the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century, a renewed grip on the masses of the believers that was carried out by rather complex pastoral work. And aside from the macroscopic evidence of the influence exercised by the most famous friars belonging to the observants, that is to say, it was mostly the minorites, right? The example in Italy is mostly Bernardino da Siena, Alberto da Sarteano, and also a Giacomo from the Marches. Also John of Capistrano, by the way, that led, as you know, with Uniati, the crusade at Belgrade in 1456. So we're looking at, big figures in the sense that, aside from their charisma and actual persuasive capacities, were playing at very high level of international politics as well. This is also due to the fact that the various orders were ever more, let's say, in fact, institutionalized, territorialized. Was a proper also internal education from which this man could be sent from here and there and making a career, acquiring more skills, education, and so on. Right? These figures, John of Capistrano is probably the first figure of a thread that brings us straight on the videos we make on the siege of Vienna, and with Father Daviano, all these the properly spiritual guides of crusade. So we're talking about the 15th century. So yes, we tend to see this period as a sort of secularizing moment in many ways, surely with humanism, etc. There is a bit that, but still do not underestimate what by the 15th century, like the average European could still believe in terms of the power, like literally of the magic of the strength of the force that these men of faith were embodying, Christianly wise. So and we're talking naturally mostly about preaching, right? We see the development of a very varied activity of teaching of the people through the preaching from the side of the various religious orders, from which it emerges a view of religion that is substantially, conforming to the expectancies of the common people. right? In particular of the middle classes of the Italian cities, and that's also why we talk about this, that were, well off, highly literate for the time, and also because, especially the Mennonites, as you know, and mendicant orders in general, were operating in a urban environment, right, where normally their work took place. So, for example, if we look at certain Florentine preachings of the second half of the century, we can see a sort of sum of 20 points of Christian doctrine that is combined with a conception of life and a religious practice based on a calculated relation of sins and merits. Almost like Florence is almost a mercantile mentality, right? It's how much are the losses, how much are the income. I have to calculate that. Important is not to go under, and thus from this summa stems a program that is centered, yes, on the sense of sin and consequently not devoid of feelings such as guilt and fear, but anyhow, comprehensively, it's satisfactorily reassuring, right? There is given the availability, disposability proper of means of salvation that are proposed by the church, and this anonymous. So this was a guy. This summa was written by this guy who was an anonymous listener to these preachings, living in Florence, who wrote carefully the instructions that were given from the pulpit, and underlying of them the traits that for him, like an individual, and we made a video specifically, yes, it was the subjectivization of the devotional art. Well, here, around that period, this is exactly the same thing. That is to say, this guy goes out there, listens what the preacher has to do, but he interprets autonomously and subjectively the most interesting things that he had heard, right? And therefore, he demonstrated his propension to, this kind of average, and also simplifying in a sense religiosity of the time, but that is also, however, reasonable, right? It's made of good deeds, of respectability, of pious practice, let's say frequency of preachings, in the sacraments, right, and in particular confession. That is the common religiosity of many of the Florentines at the time. That is a religiosity accessible also into its doctrinal pillars that were, here the numerical, almost mercantile accounting mentality comes back, because these pillars were rendered, in memory, were learned by heart through a game of numbers, because there were the 10 commandments, the 12 articles of faith, the 3 theological virtues, the 7 sacraments, the 7 virtues, the 7 vices, the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, and the 7 works of mercy, the 8 beatitudes, etc. So it was literally like a mental exercise. You learned these things, you felt safer in it, and to such religiosity, that, picture it in mind, this is held by well-defined rules, right? It is fueled by a work of education that we don't have to underestimate, right? Considering this is also a moment in which the print comes in, right? So it provides, as we've seen in the video we made on what's behind the market of in that case was in Germany, and especially of Gutenberg's Bible, not only because he didn't publish just that, but also those we had come before were kind of, more or less in the same market, to the spread of new ideas, right? And therefore, this spread in the masses invited the whole church, by the range now these ideas had, also in the work of its bishops, and in particular of some of them that were more committed at that point in the pastoral work. So in this way, there was, say, a variously organically organized instrument that wasn't systematically used. Like, for example, the visit to the diocese in order to control the functioning of the institution proposed to the cure of the soul was, happening not so regularly, but let's say exactly from the verbals of such inspections that express the contemporary programs, in concretely what this discipline had to be about. It emerges an image of the so-called good faithful, good believer, that is very similar to the one that we have exemplified for Florence, but with interesting adjustments when, as it often happens, they happen in the countryside. Right, and this is interesting because naturally the countryside and the city are very different. Doesn't matter how close or intertwined, but the countryside is still home to different beliefs, and naturally, very old ones. You can't say you're talking about. Well, yes, I mean, in a country like Italy, which is a fully Christianized reality, but if you go to Germany, I don't know, certain areas. Wouldn't be surprised that by Luther's times, especially in the north and the east, they still, they were Christian formally, but they still believed kind of pagan stuff. Like, even if they weren't aware of that, but to them it was normal because it had always been like that, right, since the Bronze Age. But these are things you can find even in places that are highly urbanized, like in the south, like in, I don't know, think about southern France. I mean, still the Middle Ages are, something very complex, very non-homogeneous in its reality. And the good believer, however, in these inspections emerges as he who or she who frequents the church during the holidays and respects the resting in the same days, that receives the sacraments when it's been established, that behaves correctly, avoiding, for example, drunkenness, swearing, gambling, adultery, quarrels, usury, and also superstitious practices. That is interesting because at the time, people, Christians habitually believed in astrology. Nobody found anything strange about that, but there were still certain other beliefs that were considered dangerous. And the fact, as we've seen in the countryside, there is kind of a bit more, bit more of a problem there. Also, it doesn't usurps the ecclesiastical goods, administratively speaking. So there is the effort, evidently, of a framing of religious life that is expressed in elementary forms. Yes, but it presents what can be observed even in these very quick lists, right? Like the some very revealing characters of sometimes of certain resistance, right? And just to speak, in fact, of the most known cases, as we were saying right now, the reliance on magical practices, as they were called, or sometimes a simple herbal medicine. Because very often, here it would be interesting to open, we'll make a video, I promise, on how, what was accepted or not around herbal medicine or whatever, not just because of religious problems, strictly speaking, also because of what they actually believed at the time. Who were these people who knew, and what they knew, and what was it actually mixed with, right? There is no, like, perfectly good or perfectly bad guy here. There were more or less people believing a bit the same things, but it was mostly about the social purpose, such activities that made the difference. We have explained many times of how the church had actually always kind of been fine with certain popular beliefs that were also a bit kind of heterodox in nature. The problem is what mostly the communities themselves thought of that, because the community started to think that, I don't know, a woman who had a traditional knowledge of herbal medicine was a witch, because it was a frustrated community for some reason, that they were superstitious and they believed that they had to be punished or something because maybe she was an emarginated or she did some, for any reason. Well, you have, what we call witch hunting, right? But we don't have to think that, there was somebody out there like a free thinker against the tyranny and oppression of the Orthodox. More or less, they basically all believed the same things, there were just, let's say, some ideas that could bother here and there somebody for some reason that has to be ascertained, and it could be a good or bad alike. But anyhow, here, see, for example, we were talking about astrology before. It happened to me to read, I think it was something from 14th century Florence. There were, the city-states had, so in a fully Christian institutionalized, they had astrologers that were paid specifically to study, the stars. And these people, were, because they always said, in order to justify the thing, that first of all, there's the Bible, right? So nobody can go against that. But, astrology is just an integration, because after all, the skies, the spheres of the heavens have been created by God, so we have to interpret the system, its correspondences, and so on. It's a part of medieval thinking. And at one point, there was one astrologer it was also kind of, these were kind of high figures, like the were, let's say, traditionalists that went out there with their strange mystics. They were actual scientists for those time standards, right? At a certain point, there is this guy begins to freak out because he states openly that the Bible is wrong because, the stars are more accurate and all this stuff. And he insists on that, and they told him, look, but, if you don't retract this, you will be burned at the stake. And he said, I don't care. He was literally burned at the stake, right? And he was a professional astrologer in a fully Christian situation. They simply said, no, the Bible is wrong, burned. That's how it happened, right? But for other reasons, that tells you how, intersected and kind of mixed and weird even the actual hierarchy of beliefs actually was, right? So that astrology was even an institutionalized thing in a Christian context. But anyhow, so it was mostly about what this, why did they burn him? Because if somebody had started to believe the same thing, it would have created problems, devotionally speaking. It would have could create disorder against the hierarchies, that when you criticize the ecclesiastical one, you intrinsically criticize also the secular ones that protect and back each other, and therefore the social order. And at the end of the day, the big things always happen like that. It was mostly about the idea of who would have to rule and why, and whether they were from the right or bad side according to them, and if this could cause a protest or disorder, turmoil, as the many that were already excessively happening at the time, they were put down, right? So we have literally to make an effort to even understand what it means, because it's not so easy for our modern mindset. Another aspect was working according to the necessity of the fields and of the animals, and not according to the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. So this was important because there was a sort of moralization and cultural training that, let's say, going parallel with the process of marginalization of the archaic custom of the peasant world, that since the 14th century was, for many reasons, ever more, say, framed and systematized by the elites than it had been in the past. And this was just the prelude to the complicated chapter of the work against witchcraft, which is something actually more modern than medieval, right? Actually, especially the Catholic Church, began because the reform has still not happened, but they abandoned it very quickly, right? In Protestant countries, look, up to the 18th century, so by the second half of the 16th century, the papacy would have considered kind of a lunacy burning a woman for witchcraft. In other countries, it was much more spread as a concept, right? And we can say at the end of this brief recognition of these topics that there is, in the Low Middle Ages and Late Middle Ages, a substantial picture of conformism about religious life at the time, and that's what the most updated historiography tends to point out the most. And however, we don't have to be so simplistic about it either, right? We made the example before of the Florentine, middle classman that wasn't, albeit not particularly inclined to mystical elan, let's say, was not stranger to personal deepening of faith, right? Deepenings that that he was invited by through, by the way, the numerous booklets of devotion that circulated in the city and that were present in the welcoming confraternities, and that boosted importantly also the market of the book at the time. And even more, there is the research of a meeting with God, right? That was pursued by communities of believers, restricted ones, but very often were intellectuals in reason of most felt convincements, let's say, of a religious conscience that went maturing through the rethinking of the nodal, let's say, I would say, nodal points of Christianity and the revival of biblical literature that exactly the print, as we were saying, would favor, and not just a few. If we talk about the 50 years, 1457, 1517, we count in Venice, for example, more than 400 Bible editions. And in the female world, finally, there was an experimentation of different forms of aggregation around the programs of life style marked by an intense relation with God, charity towards their neighbor. Let's think, for example, the circle, such as the Roman one of Francesca Bussa dei Ponziani, that is this Saint Francis, right? If you go in the forum, you see that white church in Rome. That's very, it's part of the landscape very stereotypically, and that was built after her. These were accompanied by ever more intense individual religious experiences, right? Women were ever more, educated individually. Albeit we have to stress still kind of the elite character of this behavior, right? But surely they had an echo, right, socially speaking, and especially in this communitary environment that also put people from different social classes in contact, right? And complexively, thus, to the effort of discipline of the religion of the believers operated by the church seems to correspond to real progress of religious life. However, the frame, even if it rightly manages to demolish the topos of the total decadence that is created by who described it, let's say, enclosed in the dramatic events of the 16th century, so the Reform, the Council of Trent, is actually pervaded by several contradictions. And according to what it's been recently exalted historiographic, there are certain elements of force and elements of weakness in this system, right? From one side, we can state that in the 15th century, at least in some environments, a wider awareness of the reasons of living Christianly was achieved. From the other, we cannot, of course, avoid to remind the endemic instrumentalization of the ecclesiastical apparatus, the fragility of the educational structures available to the same clergy, the fragmentary nature of the, especially the ones invented by the lay people themselves, from themselves. There is the confraternities, in fact. While the same exercise of a regulated religion was surely useful, if anything, on a level of uniformity or uniformization of the custom, well, it would prove, let's say, unsatisfactory to recreate more authentic unity of faith. And when the 15th century ended, even if in some dioceses, for example, in Padua with Piero Barozzi 1487, 1507, or even better in Verona with Gian Matteo Ghiberti 1524, 1543, gigantic efforts to reanimate religious life were carried out by putting together different components of the local church. The signals of a new crisis were very visible, right? The ideal of a societas Christiana that could, let's say, encompass the West to reach the entire world, and therefore a corresponding unitary figure of the believer was declining, right? Was reaching its sunset, basically, and to leave space to instead what it's bit the standard vocabulary of the modern age. It will still bring together with us, that is, institutionally adjectivized figures such as the Catholic, the Lutheran, the Calvinist, the Gallican, right now, are the expression of the devastating rupture that we all know in the modern age, Christianly wise, and that had never been quite recompacted. But anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.